They were hunting a criminal's blood, but all Elias Turner saw was a girl freezing in the dust, her small frame barely moving beside his broken fence as the late afternoon sun burned low across the plains, the kind of light that made everything look honest even when it wasn't. His boots slowed before his mind could catch up, each step crunching over dry earth, and for a long second he just stood there, hat casting a shadow over eyes that had learned not to get involved. Not anymore, not after. 12 years of silence stretching mile after mile around his ranch like a promise he refused to break. But the girl didn't look up, didn't beg, didn't even flinch when his shadow reached her. And that was what unsettled him most. Because out here, anyone that desperate either begged or ran, and she did neither. The wind dragged across the fields, carrying dust and the faint scent of sage, tugging at the torn edges of her clothing, revealing skin marked not by weakness but by endurance, and when she finally opened her eyes, they were sharp, too sharp, not the eyes of someone lost but the eyes of someone measuring distance, counting exits, weighing him in a way no child should, and Elias felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for, something between caution and something older, something human. "You alone?" he asked, voice low, steady, the kind of voice that didn't expect an answer, but she didn't speak, just watched him. And in that silence he understood more than words could have given him, because silence like that wasn't fear, it was control. The sun dipped another inch, shadows growing longer, and Elias knew what came with night out here, cold that cut through bone, the kind that didn't ask questions before it took what it wanted, and still he hesitated, because helping meant risk, and risk had a way of finding him even when he stayed still. But then the girl shifted slightly, a small movement, almost nothing, and it broke something in him that had been locked tight for years, so he reached down, slow enough not to startle her, lifting her like she weighed no more than a bundle of dry hay, though he could feel the tension in her, the readiness, as if she might bolt even now, and he carried her toward the house without another word. Inside, the air was cooler, thick with the faint smell of wood smoke and old leather, the kind of place that held memories even when no one spoke of them. And he set her down by the fire, pouring water into a tin cup, holding it out, and she took it without hesitation, drinking just enough, not too fast, not too much. Again that control. And Elias noticed it the way a man notices weather shifting before a storm, quiet but certain. He set a bowl of stew beside her, watching as she ate, not like someone starving, but like someone conserving strength, each movement deliberate. And the room filled with a silence that wasn't empty but waiting, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them, until he finally said, "Name?" And she paused just long enough to matter before answering. "Lena," her voice soft but steady, and Elias nodded once, though something in him knew that wasn't the whole truth, not even close. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a different sound now, distant but unmistakable. The low rhythm of hooves pressing against the earth miles away, and Lena's hand tightened slightly around something at her chest, something Elias hadn't noticed before, a pendant worn on a thin cord, old, worn smooth by time, but heavy in a way that didn't match the rest of her, and her eyes flicked toward the door for the briefest second, that same calculating look returning. And Elias felt it then, clear as the horizon at dawn. This wasn't chance, she hadn't ended up here by accident. And whatever was coming wasn't either. The fire popped, sending a brief shower of sparks upward, and Elias leaned back slightly in his chair, watching her without staring, giving her space the way you give a wild thing space. Not out of fear but respect, and for a moment, just a moment, the world outside seemed far away, the ranch quiet, the night settling in like it always did. But beneath it all there was something else now, something moving closer with every passing second, something that would reach his door before the stars finished climbing the sky. And Elias Turner, who had spent 12 years avoiding trouble, realized with a slow, steady certainty that trouble had already found him, and it was sitting right there by his fire, holding something worth more than it should have been, something men would ride for. The night settled slowly over the ranch, stretching shadows across the wooden floor while the fire burned low and steady, and Elias Turner sat without moving, listening the way a man listens when he knows something is coming but does not yet know what shape it will take. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind against the walls carrying weight now, and across from him Lena remained exactly where he had left her, back straight, hands close, eyes never quite resting, as if sleep was something she had chosen to leave behind long before she reached his door. The pendant rested in her palm now, no longer hidden, its surface catching the firelight in brief, quiet flashes, and Elias noticed how her fingers curved around it not with fear, but with purpose, like a person holding something that mattered more than comfort, more than safety, and he found himself wondering not what it was worth, but what it meant, because out here, meaning always cost more than money. You expecting someone, he said after a while, his voice low, not accusing, just placing the question between them, and Lena did not answer right away, her gaze drifting toward the window where the last of the daylight had faded into a deep blue that pressed against the glass. And when she finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. They will come anyway. Not fear, not warning, just a statement. And Elias felt that same quiet shift in his chest again, that sense that this girl understood something he did. Not. Outside, the wind changed direction, carrying with it the distant echo of movement across open land, faint but steady, and Elias rose from his chair without urgency, crossing the room with the calm of a man who had spent years learning how to move without drawing attention, his hand brushing lightly against the doorframe as he stepped out onto the porch, the night air cooler now, brushing against his face with a dry edge, and there it was, far off along the line where land met sky, a thin trail of dust barely visible in the moonlight, moving with intention. He stood there for a long second, hat low, eyes fixed on that distant line, counting without needing to see clearly, 1, 2, maybe 3 riders, not rushing, not wandering, coming straight. And he let out a slow breath that carried no surprise, only confirmation. Inside, Lena had not moved, but her posture had changed in a way most people would not notice, shoulders tighter, head slightly turned, listening not with her ears, but with something deeper. And when Elias stepped back inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click, she looked at him once, just once, and in that glance there was no question, only understanding. You should leave before they get here, she said, the words steady, almost gentle, as if she was offering him a way out he had not asked for. And Elias leaned against the wall for a moment, arms loose at his sides, considering that simple sentence the way a man considers a long road ahead, not for its distance but for where it leads, and he shook his head slightly, more to himself than to her. This land does not run, he said, and it was not defiance, not pride, just truth, the kind that had kept him rooted in one place while everything else moved on without him. Lena studied him then, really studied him, the way she had when he first found her, measuring something he could not see, and for a brief second, something softer passed through her expression, something almost like recognition, before it disappeared again beneath that same controlled stillness. The fire cracked, sending a low glow across the room, and Elias reached for another log, placing it carefully on the embers, feeding the flame not because he needed the warmth, but because the light mattered, because darkness had a way of making decisions harder than they needed to be, and as the fire grew, it lit the pendant more clearly, revealing lines etched into its surface, patterns that did not belong to decoration alone, and Elias stepped closer, not reaching for it, just looking, letting his eyes follow the marks the way a man reads tracks in dirt. That is not something a poor girl carries, he said quietly, and Lena closed her fingers around it again, slow, deliberate. I never said I was poor, she replied, and there it was, not a lie, not a truth, something in between, and Elias felt a faint, almost invisible smile pull at the corner of his mouth, not amusement, but recognition of a different kind of strength, one that did not need to be spoken loudly to be understood. The sound of hooves came again, closer now, no longer distant enough to ignore, steady against the earth, and the air in the room shifted with it, tightening, not with panic, but with inevitability, and Elias moved toward the door once more, stopping just before he reached it, his hand hovering near the handle, not opening it yet, not closing anything off, just standing there in that narrow space between choice and consequence, while behind him, Lena remained still, watching, waiting, holding on to something that had brought the world to his doorstep, and for the first time in a long while, Elias Turner did not feel alone in that silence. because whatever was coming, it was no longer just his to face. The first rider did not rush when he came into view, and that was how Elias knew these were not men chasing shadows, but men who already believed they had found what they were looking for. The horses slowing as they reached the edge of the property, hooves pressing soft into the dry earth like they belonged there, like this land was just another place to pass through and claim without asking. And Elias stood on the porch with one hand resting loosely against the doorframe, not blocking, not inviting, just present in a way that made a man think twice before stepping closer. The moon had climbed high enough now to cast a pale light across the field, outlining three figures clearly, coats dusty, hats low, the quiet authority of men used to being listened to even when they spoke softly, and the one in front dismounted without a word, boots hitting the ground with a dull, steady sound, his gaze lifting to meet Elias with the kind of calm that carried questions already shaped into answers. "Evening," the man said, voice even, almost polite, and Elias nodded once in return, neither welcoming nor turning him away, just letting the moment settle between them like dust and still air. "You ride a long way for an evening visit," Elias replied, his tone matching the other man's, measured, unhurried, and the man allowed a faint shift at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement. "We follow what needs following," he said, glancing briefly toward the house, not searching, just noting, and that small movement told Elias everything he needed to know. They were not guessing, they were confirming. Behind him, the other two riders remained mounted, silent, watching not with impatience but with purpose, their presence filling the space without a word spoken, and the night seemed to hold its breath around them. "We are looking for a girl," the man continued, his eyes returning to Elias, steady, young, tribal, traveling alone, each word placed carefully, like stones laid in a path, and Elias shifted his weight slightly, the wood beneath his boots creaking just enough to break the stillness. "A lot of people pass through land like this," he said. "Not all of them stop." And the man tilted his head a fraction, studying him in that quiet way men do when they are deciding whether they are being told a lie or a truth that sounds like one. "This one stops," the man said, "because she carries something that does not belong to her." And the words lingered there, heavier than they needed to be, and Elias felt it settle into place, not as a threat, but as a fact being offered. From inside the house, there was no sound, no movement. Lena had gone still in a way that made the walls feel thicker, the air quieter, and Elias knew she was listening to every word, weighing every breath, and he found himself doing the same, not just to the man in front of him, but to what lay beneath those words. "Things have a way of ending up where they are meant to be," Elias said, his gaze never leaving the man's face, and for the first time, something flickered in the man's eyes, not surprise, not anger, just a brief recognition that this would not be as simple as asking and receiving. The wind shifted again, brushing past the three riders and carrying with it the faint scent of the fire from inside, and the man's gaze drifted once more toward the door, then back, slower this time, more deliberate. "You live alone out here," he said, not as a question, but as a piece of information laid gently on the table, and Elias nodded once. "Been that way for a while." And the man took a step forward, not crossing the line of the porch, but close enough that the distance between them felt smaller than it was. "Then you know how things work," the man said, voice lowering slightly. "Out here, people mind what is theirs, and they return what is not." And Elias let the silence stretch for a heartbeat longer than comfort allowed before answering. "Out here, people also decide for themselves what belongs." And that was when the night changed, not loudly, not with any sudden movement, but in the way the air tightened just enough that every sound seemed sharper, every breath more noticeable. Behind him, inside the house, Lena's hand tightened once more around the pendant, the small object now the center of something much larger than its size. And though Elias could not see her, he could feel that shift the same way he felt a storm before it broke. And for a moment, the man in front of him seemed to sense it too, his gaze sharpening just slightly, as if he could see through wood and shadow to what waited beyond. "We are not here to make trouble," the man said after a pause, and there was something honest in that, not kindness, but restraint. "We are here to take back what was taken," and Elias looked at him for a long second, weighing not the words, but the space between them, the part that was never spoken, and then he straightened just a fraction, enough to make it clear where he stood without raising his voice or his hands. "Then you might be in the wrong place," he said quietly, and the wind carried his words across the porch, out into the open land beyond, where the night waited, silent, watching, as if it too wanted to see what would happen next. The man did not answer right away, and that silence carried more weight than any threat could have, his eyes holding on Elias just a second longer, as if measuring not the words but the man who spoke them. And then he glanced past him once more toward the door, slower this time, like he already knew what stood behind it even without seeing. And when he spoke again, his voice had shifted, not louder, not sharper, just more certain. "Nothing that valuable ends up somewhere by accident," he said. And the wind brushed between them, pulling dust across the ground in thin lines that vanished as quickly as they formed. And Elias remained where he was, steady, unmoved, his presence filling the narrow space of the porch in a way that made stepping forward feel like a decision, not a right. "You ever notice," Elias said after a moment, his tone calm, almost reflective, "how men who say they are not here for trouble are usually the ones who bring it with them?" And the man's expression shifted just enough to show he heard the weight behind that, though he did not take offense, only a slight narrowing of the eyes, as if adjusting focus. Behind him, one of the mounted riders shifted in the saddle, not impatient, just aware that the line between talking and something else was growing thinner, and the horses exhaled softly, warm breath drifting into the cold night air. "We are not here for you," the man said, and there was something close to honesty in that. "We are here for what she carries." And Elias let that settle, because it confirmed what he had already begun to understand, that this was never about the girl alone, never about her being tribal or young or alone. It was about that small object now hidden in her hand, something that had drawn these men across miles of open land without hesitation. Inside, Lena had not moved from her place by the fire, but her breathing had slowed, controlled, each inhale measured, each exhale quiet, as if she was keeping herself anchored in the moment while everything else moved around her, and her eyes remained fixed on the door, not with fear, but with readiness, the kind that came from knowing there was no more running left to do. "You could turn around," Elias said, his voice still low, still even. "Ride back the way you came. Let the night swallow your tracks." And the man looked at him for a long second, considering not the suggestion, but the possibility behind it. And then he shook his head once, almost regretful. "That is not how this ends," he replied, and the words did not carry threat, only certainty, the kind that comes from orders already given, paths already chosen. The silence stretched again, longer this time, and Elias could feel the weight of the land behind him, the miles of empty space that had once been his shield now offering no protection at all, because whatever this was, it had found him anyway, and he understood then that this moment was not about stopping what was coming. It was about deciding how it would be met. He stepped forward just enough that the porch light caught more of his face, revealing lines carved by years of quiet living, eyes that had seen enough to know when something mattered beyond reason, and he rested his hand lightly against the door, not opening it, not closing it further, just claiming that space as his own. "You say it does not belong to her," Elias said. "Maybe it does not belong to you either." And the man's gaze held steady, but there was a pause now, a small break in the rhythm of his certainty, as if that thought had not been part of the path he followed. Behind him, the other riders remained still, but their attention had sharpened, drawn tighter around the exchange like a rope pulled slowly taut. Inside, Lena's fingers loosened just slightly around the pendant, enough to let its edge press into her palm, grounding her, and for the first time since she arrived, she took a small step forward, silent, careful, stopping just behind the door where she could hear everything, where she could choose what came next. The fire behind her flickered, casting shifting light across the walls, and for a brief moment, the reflection caught the edge of the pendant again, revealing more of its surface, lines that were not decoration but direction, a map hidden in plain sight, and Lena's eyes closed for half a second as if remembering something, or someone, before opening again with that same steady resolve. Outside, the The man finally took another step closer, stopping at the base of the porch, close enough now that the distance between them felt almost gone, and he looked up at Elias with a gaze that carried no anger, only purpose. "We do not want the girl," he said quietly. "We want what she was trusted to carry." And the words settled into the night like a truth that could not be taken back, and Elias felt something shift inside him once more, not uncertainty, not fear, but clarity, because now he understood the shape of what stood before him. Not men hunting a child, but men chasing something larger than any one person. He glanced once over his shoulder toward the door, just for a second, enough to know she was there, listening, waiting, and then he looked back at the man, his voice steady as the land beneath his feet. "Then you should have come for it sooner," he said, and the wind moved again, carrying that sentence out into the dark, where it hung for a moment before fading, leaving behind only the quiet certainty that whatever happened next had already begun. The words settled between them like dust after a long ride, and for a moment no one moved. Not Elias on the porch, not the man at the base of the steps, not even the horses that stood quiet under the pale wash of moonlight. And then the man exhaled slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if something in what Elias had said had shifted the path he had expected to follow. "Sooner would not have mattered," he replied, his voice calm, carrying none of the urgency most men would bring to something they claimed was valuable. Some things only reveal themselves when they choose to, and Elias watched him closely, not the words, but the space behind them, the place where intention lived, and he began to understand that whatever this was, it was not just about taking something back, it was about timing, about patience, about waiting until the right moment to step forward. Inside the house, Lena's breathing slowed even further, her fingers now resting open around the pendant instead of gripping it. And for the first time since the riders arrived, she lowered her gaze to it, studying the worn surface as if searching for something that had not been there before, and in the shifting light of the fire, the etched lines seemed deeper now, more defined, as if the heat itself was coaxing them into clarity. She tilted it slightly, and the reflection changed, faint markings aligning in a way that had not been visible before, and her eyes widened just a fraction, not in fear, but in recognition, as though she had been waiting for this, not the riders, but this moment. Outside, Elias shifted his stance, one foot settling more firmly against the wooden boards beneath him, grounding himself in something solid while the rest of the world seemed to hover just beyond certainty. And he spoke again, quieter this time. "You talk like you have been chasing more than a girl." And the man nodded once, not denying it, not confirming it outright either, just acknowledging the direction of the thought. "The girl is not the point," he said. "She is the key." And the word lingered there, simple, heavy, undeniable, and Elias felt it settle into place, everything narrowing down to that single idea, that Lena had never been what they were after. She had only been the one carrying what mattered. The wind brushed past again, softer now, as if the land itself was listening, and Elias glanced briefly toward the horizon, where the faint trail of dust had long since settled into stillness. No more riders coming, just the three already here, and whatever decision would be made between them. Behind him, the faint creak of a floorboard broke the silence, so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Elias heard it, and so did the man below, their eyes shifting at the same time toward the door, and in that shared awareness, something changed, not tension, not threat, but inevitability. The door opened just a fraction, not wide, just enough to let a thin line of firelight spill out onto the porch, and Lena stepped into that narrow space, her figure small against the darkness behind her, but steady, composed in a way that made her seem older than she was. And she did not look at Elias first. She looked at the man, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without fear. The man's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened, focusing entirely on her now, as if the rest of the world had fallen away. And for a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching long enough to feel like something deliberate, something chosen. Lena lifted the pendant slightly, not offering it, not hiding it, just holding it where the light could catch it, and the etched lines glimmered faintly, forming patterns that suggested paths, intersections, directions that only made sense when seen together, and the man's eyes followed those lines with quiet intensity, not reaching, not stepping forward, just seeing. "You came a long way," Lena said softly, her voice carrying across the short distance between them with a calm that did not belong to someone her age, and the man inclined his head slightly. "So did you," he replied, and there was something different in his tone now, not authority, not command, something closer to respect. Elias stood still beside the door, watching the exchange unfold, feeling the shift in the air as control moved, not from one person to another, but into something shared, something that none of them fully owned. Lena lowered the pendant again, her fingers closing around it gently, and she glanced once at Elias, just a brief look, but enough to say more than words, a question, a choice, a line being drawn without being spoken, and Elias met her gaze, holding it for a second that stretched longer than it should have, and in that second, something settled between them, not agreement, not understanding, but trust, the quiet kind that does not need to be named. She turned back to the man, her voice steady. "If you take it, you will not know what to do with it," she said, and the man did not argue, did not dismiss it, only considered. The way a man considers a truth he does not yet fully see. "Then you will show us," he answered, and the wind moved again, carrying that sentence out into the open land, where it seemed to wait, like everything else, for what would come next. The man did not step forward when he said it, and that restraint carried more meaning than any movement could have. His eyes fixed on Lena with a quiet patience that suggested he had waited a long time for this moment and was willing to wait a little longer. And Lena did not answer him right away, her fingers still wrapped around the pendant, as if she could feel something beneath its surface that no one else could. And the firelight flickered across her face, revealing not fear, not defiance, but something steadier, something rooted deeper than either. The night air pressed in around them, cool and still, and Elias stood just beside the door, close enough to step between them if he had to, but not moving, not interrupting, because whatever this was, it had moved beyond him now, beyond simple choices of helping or turning away, and into something that belonged to both of them. Lena finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. "It is not something you can take," she said, lifting the pendant slightly again, letting it catch the light. "It only works when it is meant to," and the man's gaze followed the movement, studying not just the object but the way she held it, the certainty in her voice. And for a moment, he said nothing, as if weighing whether to challenge her or listen, and then he asked, "And who decides that?" Not sharp, not mocking, just asking the question that had been waiting there from the beginning. Lena's eyes shifted briefly toward Elias, then back to the man, and there was a pause, a breath, the kind that marks a line being crossed. And when she answered, it was not the answer either of them expected. "It was never mine," she said quietly. "I was only told to carry it until the right place found me." And the words settled into the air like something older than the moment itself, something that had been set in motion long before any of them stood here. Elias felt that in his chest, the weight of it, the sense that this was not chance, not coincidence, but something placed carefully along a path none of them had fully seen. And he glanced at the pendant again, noticing how the lines seemed clearer now than they had before, how they aligned in ways that suggested direction, distance, purpose. The man took a slow breath, his posture shifting slightly, not forward, not back, just adjusting. And for the first time since he arrived, there was something like uncertainty in his expression, not doubt, but the recognition that this was no longer a simple retrieval, no longer a matter of possession. "Then you have brought it where it needs to be," he said, and his voice had changed again, softer now, less certain of its own authority, and Lena shook her head once, a small, controlled movement. "No," she replied. "I did not bring it here." And her eyes moved to Elias, holding his for a second longer than before. "It brought me here." And the wind moved again, brushing past the porch, carrying that sentence out into the dark where it seemed to linger, echoing in a way that made the silence afterward feel heavier. Elias did not speak, but something inside him settled into place, a quiet understanding that whatever this was, whatever the pendant meant, his role in it had already been chosen the moment he stepped toward her in the dust, and he rested, his hand against the door again, not out of habit now, but as if anchoring himself to that moment, to that choice. The man followed Lena's gaze to Elias, studying him in a new way, not as an obstacle, not as a bystander, but as part of something larger, and he nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a piece of the puzzle that had not been clear before. Behind him, one of the riders shifted slightly in the saddle, the faint creak of leather breaking the stillness, a reminder that time was still moving, that whatever decision was coming could not be held in place forever. Lena took a small step forward, out onto the porch fully now, the light from the house falling behind her and outlining her against the night, and she opened her hand, letting the pendant rest in her palm, visible, unhidden, and for a moment, it seemed to pulse with something not quite seen, not quite understood. The etched lines catching the moonlight in a way that made them seem alive. "If you take it now," she said, her voice steady, "it will become nothing." And the man watched her closely, searching her face for something, perhaps a sign of deception, perhaps a sign of truth, and finding neither, only that same quiet certainty that had been there from the beginning. Elias shifted his stance slightly, the wood beneath his boots creaking softly, grounding the moment again, and he spoke, not to challenge, not to lead, but to place something simple and clear into the space between them. "Then maybe it is not meant to be taken," he said, and the man's eyes moved to him, holding there for a long second, considering not just the words but the man who said them. And then he looked back at Lena, the silence stretching once more, deeper now, heavier, as if all three of them stood at the edge of something that could not be stepped back from. The wind slowed, the land grew still, and for a moment, it felt as if even time itself had paused, waiting for what would come next. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like wind changing direction across open land, and the man at the base of the porch took a breath that seemed to carry more weight than before, his gaze no longer fixed only on the pendant, but moving between Lena and Elias as if trying to understand how the two had come to stand on the same side of something neither of them had asked for. And for the first time since he arrived, he removed his hat, not as a sign of surrender, not as weakness, but as respect for something he could not yet name. "Then this place matters," he said quietly, almost to himself. And Elias did not answer right away, because he felt it too now, the way the land seemed to hold the moment, the way the air pressed in not with tension but with purpose, and he realized that whatever this pendant was, it was not just leading men across miles. It was anchoring something here, in this exact place, at this exact time. Lena lowered her hand slightly, the pendant still visible, still catching the faint light, and she looked past the man, past the riders, out toward the open dark as if she could see something beyond the horizon, something that had not yet arrived. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet certainty that did not belong to someone who had been running. She said, "It would not make sense until I stopped running," she said. And the words hung there, and Elias felt them settle into him in a way that felt almost familiar, as if he had been living them without knowing it. All those years alone, all those miles of silence. The man's brow tightened slightly, not in anger, but in thought. "Who said that?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer, and Lena's fingers closed gently around the pendant again, not hiding it, just holding it closer now. "My mother," she said. And there it was, spoken plainly, without weight or drama, but the effect of it moved through the air like a distant echo finally reaching its source. The two riders behind the man shifted subtly, not stepping forward, not interrupting, but the name, even unspoken, had meaning to them, and Elias noticed the way their posture changed. More alert, more focused, as if a piece of the story they had been following had just come into view. The man nodded once, slow, measured, "Ravenhale," he said, and it was not a question, and Lena did not react to the name, did not flinch, did not deny it. She simply stood there, steady, as if the truth of it had never been something she needed to protect. Elias felt that name settle into the space between them, heavier than anything else that had been said, and he glanced briefly at Lena, seeing her now not just as the girl he had found in the dust, but as something more. Something connected to a story that had been moving long before it reached his land. "She has been ahead of us the whole time," the man continued, more to himself than to them, and there was something almost like admiration in his voice, not for the chase, but for the way it had been led. Lena lifted her gaze to meet his again, and there was no pride there, no fear, just truth. She is not running, she said. She is placing things where they need to be. And the wind moved again, softer now, as if agreeing, as if carrying that understanding across the land itself. Elias exhaled slowly, the weight of it all settling into him. And he realized then that the pendant, the riders, the girl, none of it had been random, none of it had been chance. It had all been part of something set in motion with intention, something that had led directly here, to his door, to this moment. And he found himself wondering not why, but what came next. The man stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but creating space. And in that small movement there was a shift, a recognition that this was no longer something he could take by force or claim by right, but something that had to be understood. And he looked at Lena with a new kind of focus. If she placed it here, he said, then something is meant to happen here. And Lena nodded once, a small movement. But certain? Yes, she replied, and her eyes moved briefly to Elias again. And this time, the look was different, not a question, not a test, but an acknowledgement, as if she now understood why she had been brought to this place, why she had stopped running at this door and not another. Elias met her gaze, holding it for a second, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need words, because both of them understood it at the same time, that whatever this was, whatever the pendant meant, it was no longer just hers to carry, and the man saw it too, the way their attention aligned, the way the space between them shifted into something shared, and he let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing just slightly. Then we are not here to take anything, he said quietly. We are here to see what she set in motion. And the night seemed to settle around that, the land growing still, as if everything, even the wind, was waiting to see what would unfold next. The night did not feel empty anymore. It felt full, as if something unseen had finally arrived and settled into the spaces between them. And Elias stood there on the porch with the weight of it pressing quietly against his chest, not heavy in a way that burdened him, but steady, like something that had been missing without him knowing it. The man below him lowered his gaze for a brief moment, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in thought, as if adjusting to a truth that had shifted beneath his feet. And when he looked up again, his eyes no longer searched for control, they searched for understanding. Then this place was chosen, he said, his voice softer now, carrying none of the sharp edges it had when he first arrived. And Elias let that sit for a second, his hand still resting lightly against the door, the wood warm from the fire behind him, grounding him in something real while everything else seemed to move into something less certain. Lena stepped forward another inch, just enough that she stood fully between the light and the dark, her figure outlined against both, and she lifted the pendant again, slower this time, as if she was not just showing it, but listening to it, and the etched lines caught the moonlight in a way that seemed different now, more complete, as though the moment itself had unlocked something within it. The air shifted, not with wind, but with stillness, the kind that comes when something important is about to reveal itself, and Lena tilted the pendant slightly, aligning it with the horizon beyond the riders, her eyes narrowing just a fraction as if following something only she could see, and then she spoke, almost to herself. It is not a map, she said, not the kind you follow with your feet. And Elias watched her closely, his attention drawn not just to the words, but to the way she said them, like someone remembering rather than discovering. And he felt that same quiet recognition stir in him again. The man below the porch stepped back another half step, giving her space without being asked, his posture no longer fixed on possession, but on observation, and the riders behind him remained still, their presence no longer pressing forward, but holding, waiting. Lena lowered the pendant slightly, turning it so that the firelight from inside joined with the moonlight from above, and for a brief second, the lines seemed to shift, not physically, but in the way they were seen, forming shapes that hinted at more than direction, something closer to a pattern, a sequence, and Elias felt his breath slow without realizing it, his eyes tracing those lines as if they were pulling something out of him, something buried beneath years of quiet living. She said it would show itself when I stopped running. Lena continued, her voice steady, and she looked up then, not at the man, but at Elias, holding his gaze in a way that felt deliberate. And in that look, there was no hesitation left, no doubt, just clarity. And Elias understood then that whatever this was, it had chosen not just the place, but the person. He did not move, did not speak, but something in his posture shifted, subtle, but real, the kind of shift that comes when a man accepts something he cannot yet fully explain. The man followed her gaze, looking at Elias now with a different kind of attention, not as someone standing in the way, but as someone standing at the center, and he nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a truth that had finally come into focus. Then it was never about finding her, he said quietly. It was about finding him. And the words settled into the night like a final piece clicking into place, and Elias felt it, clear and undeniable, the way everything had led here, not by accident, not by chance, but by design. The wind moved again, softer than before, brushing across the land like a breath released after being held too long, and Lena lowered the pendant into her palm, closing her fingers around it gently, as if the moment of showing had passed, and what remained was something quieter, something deeper. She trusted that this place would hold, Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper now. That someone here would understand without being told. And Elias looked at her for a long second, the firelight flickering behind her, the moonlight framing her from the front. And he realized that she was not asking him anything, not seeking permission or guidance. She was simply stating what already was. He glanced out over the land. The same land he had walked for years without thinking twice about it. And for the first time, it did not feel empty. It felt chosen, and he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, grounded. The man stepped back fully now, one foot returning to the dirt, creating a clear space between himself and the porch. And there was no tension left in the movement, only acceptance, and he placed his hat back on his head, not as a return to authority, but as a quiet acknowledgement that whatever had brought him here had already reached its purpose. The riders behind him shifted slightly, their horses turning just enough to face the open land again, and the night seemed to open with them, the path forward no longer fixed on this place, but moving beyond it. Lena remained where she was, the pendant now hidden once more in her hand, and she looked at Elias one last time in that moment, and in that look there was something like relief, not because the danger had passed, but because the meaning had been found. And Elias met her gaze, steady, understanding not with words, but with something deeper, something that did not need to be explained, and the silence that followed was no longer waiting. It was complete. The stillness did not break when the riders turned their horses. It deepened, settling into the land like something that had finally found its place. And Elias remained on the porch without moving, watching as the man adjusted his reins with a calm that no longer carried urgency, only completion. And the horses shifted slowly, hooves pressing into the dirt with quiet purpose, turning away not in retreat, but in acceptance that whatever they had come for was no longer something they could take with them. The man looked back one last time, not at the pendant, not even at Lena, but at Elias. And there was something unspoken in that look, something like acknowledgement, something like a silent agreement that had never been voiced, and he gave a small nod, not formal, not forced. Just enough to mark the moment before he turned fully and guided his horse toward the open dark. The other two riders followed without question, their silhouettes fading gradually into the wide stretch of land beyond, until the sound of hooves softened, then disappeared completely, leaving behind only the wind and the quiet weight of what had just passed. Elias did not move right away, his gaze still fixed on the space where they had been, as if the absence itself held meaning, and slowly, he exhaled, the breath long and steady, carrying with it the last trace of tension that had lingered in his chest. And when he finally turned back toward the door, Lena was still standing there, exactly where she had been, the pendant hidden once more in her hand, her posture unchanged but her presence different now, lighter in a way that did not come from relief, but from certainty. The fire behind her had burned lower, casting softer light across the room, and the shadows moved gently along the walls as if the house itself had settled back into its familiar rhythm. But Elias knew it was not the same. Something had shifted. Something had been placed here that could not be undone. "They will not come back," Lena said quietly, her voice carrying no doubt, and Elias nodded once, Because he felt it too, not as a belief, but as a fact, the kind that settles into a place and stays there. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft, final sound, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer tense, no longer waiting, but full, like a space that had been filled exactly as it was meant to be. Elias moved toward the table, his boots slow against the wooden floor, and he poured water into a tin cup, setting it down near Lena without a word, and she accepted it with a small nod, her fingers brushing briefly against the metal before wrapping around it, grounding herself in something simple after everything that had just unfolded. She took a sip, then lowered the cup, her eyes drifting to the fire, watching the flames the way someone watches something they're trying to understand, not with urgency, but with patience. She knew, Lena said after a while, her voice softer now, more reflective, and Elias glanced at her, waiting, not asking, just giving the space for the words to come. She knew I would stop here, Lena continued, her gaze still on the fire. Not because of the land, but because of you, and Elias felt that settle into him in a way that was both unexpected and strangely familiar, like a truth that had been there long before he heard it spoken. He leaned slightly against the edge of the table, arms relaxed, eyes steady. I did not do anything, he said quietly, and Lena shook her head once, a small movement, but certain. You did, she replied, lifting her gaze to meet his. You did not turn away, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else that had been said, and Elias let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a man realizes that what he thought was small was never small at all. The fire cracked softly, a brief spark rising and fading, and Lena opened her hand, revealing the pendant again, but this time it did not seem to hold the same pull, the same quiet energy it had before. It was still, ordinary in a way it had not been, as if whatever it needed to do had already been done. Elias looked at it for a moment, then back at her, and he did not ask what it meant now, because he understood that some things did not need to be explained once they had served their purpose. Lena closed her fingers around it again, gently, not protecting it, just holding it, and she looked toward the door for a brief second, then back at Elias, and there was a different kind of question in her eyes now, not about what had been, but about what would come next. Elias followed her gaze, then returned it, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to carry the weight of the choice that now rested between them. And then Elias straightened slightly, his posture shifting with quiet resolve. You can stay, he said simply, not as an offer, not as a favor, but as a statement, the kind that did not need explanation. Lena watched him for a second, her expression unreadable, and then she nodded once, slow and certain, and in that small movement, something settled into place again, not as part of a larger plan, not as something set in motion by someone else, but as a choice made here, in this moment, by the two of them. Outside, the wind moved gently across the land, carrying no urgency, no tension, just the quiet rhythm of a place returning to itself, and inside, the fire burned low and steady, casting a warm glow over a space that no longer felt empty. And for the first time in a long while, Elias Turner stood in his own home and did not feel alone. Morning came slow, not with sudden light, but with a gradual softening of the dark, the horizon turning pale gray before the sun ever showed itself. And Elias was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed with his boots in his hands, listening to the quiet in a way that felt different now, no longer empty, no longer something to fill, but something to share. The fire in the main room had burned down to low embers, casting a faint warmth that lingered in the air, and when he stepped out, he saw Lena already awake, seated near the window, her posture straight, her eyes turned toward the land beyond as if she had been watching the dawn arrive one shade at a time. She did not turn when he entered, but she knew he was there, and after a moment, she spoke without looking at him. It feels different, her voice soft, thoughtful, and Elias leaned lightly against the wall, following her gaze out toward the open stretch of land. It always does after a storm, he said, though there had been no rain, no thunder, nothing visible that would explain the shift, and yet the air carried that same sense of clearing, of something having passed through and left things changed. Lena nodded slightly, her fingers resting loosely around the pendant now tucked into her palm. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence comfortable, unforced, like something that had been earned. Outside, the cattle moved slowly across the field, their shapes dark against the growing light, and the wind carried the faint scent of dry grass and distant hills, familiar, steady, and Elias found himself noticing it in a way he had not before, as if the land itself had taken on a new meaning simply by being seen through someone else's eyes. "What happens now?" Lena asked after a while, her voice quiet but clear, and Elias considered the question, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood that the answer mattered more than it would have before. He pushed himself off the wall and moved toward the door, opening it slowly, letting the early light spill into the room, and he stepped out onto the porch, the boards cool beneath his boots, the world stretching wide and open before him, unchanged and yet not the same. Lena followed a moment later, stopping just behind him, her presence close enough to feel, but not crowding, and together they stood there, looking out over the land that had brought them together, without either of them asking for it. "Now," Elias said finally, his voice steady, grounded, "we do what comes next." And Lena tilted her head slightly, as if weighing the simplicity of that answer, and then she nodded, because sometimes simple was the only thing that made sense. The sun broke over the horizon then, a thin line of gold cutting across the edge of the world, and the light spread slowly, touching the fields, the fence, the house, and finally them, and in that moment, the pendant. In Lena's hand caught the light one last time, not glowing, not shifting, just reflecting, like any ordinary piece of metal, and she looked down at it, studying it in the morning light, and for the first time since Elias had seen it, it did not seem to carry anything beyond what it was, no hidden lines, no shifting meaning, just a small object resting in her palm. She closed her fingers around it gently, not with urgency, not with purpose, just holding it, and she looked up at Elias, her expression calm, settled. "It is done," she said, and there was no question in her voice, no uncertainty, just a quiet certainty that did not need to be proven. Elias nodded once, because he felt it too, the way the weight of the night had lifted, the way whatever had been set in motion had reached its end, not with noise, not with force, but with stillness. He stepped down from the porch, the dirt firm beneath his boots, and walked a few paces out into the yard, glancing back once to see Lena still standing there, watching him, and he gestured slightly with his hand, not commanding, not inviting, just indicating that she could follow if she chose to, and after a brief moment, she did, stepping down beside him, her feet finding the ground with the same quiet certainty she had carried since the moment he found her. They walked a short distance together, not speaking, just moving, the rhythm of their steps matching without effort, and the land stretched out around them, wide and open, the same as it had always been, but no longer empty. After a while, Lena slowed, her gaze drifting back toward the house, and she stopped, turning slightly. "She will not come here," she said, not as a worry, but as a statement, and Elias stopped beside her, following her gaze. "No," he replied, "she will not need to." And Lena nodded, understanding that whatever her mother had set in motion had never required her to return, only to trust that it would reach the place it was meant to. The wind moved gently across the field, lifting the edge of Lena's hair, carrying with it the quiet sound of the waking land, and Elias looked out over it all, the fences, the cattle, the endless stretch of sky, and then back at the house, and he realized that nothing about it had changed, and yet everything had, because now it held more than just him, more than just silence. Lena turned back to him then, her eyes steady, and there was no more searching in them, no more running, just presence, and Elias met her gaze, holding it for a moment that felt longer than it was, and then he nodded once, a simple motion, but enough, and together they turned back toward the house, the morning light rising behind them, steady and sure, as if it had always known exactly where to go. The day moved forward in quiet layers, the kind that did not rush or demand attention, just unfolded one moment at a time, and Elias worked the way he always had, steady, deliberate, hands knowing the rhythm of the land without needing thought. But there was something different now, not in what he did, but in how it felt, as if the space around him had shifted just enough to make room for something new. Lena followed at a distance at first, watching more than speaking, her steps light against the dry ground, her eyes taking in everything: the fences, the cattle, the slow movement of clouds across the sky. And Elias noticed it without looking directly, the way. She observed without asking, learned without needing to be told. He paused near the far end of the field, resting his hand against a weathered post, and glanced back toward her. "You do not have to stay quiet," he said, not as a command, just an opening, and Lena stepped closer, her gaze lifting to meet his. "I am listening," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her voice, only intention, and Elias gave a small nod, because that made sense, because sometimes listening was the only way to understand what mattered. They walked along the fence line together, the wood worn smooth by years of sun and wind, and the land stretched out around them, wide and open, the same land Elias had walked alone for so long, now carrying a different weight simply because he was no longer the only one moving through it. "This place," Lena said after a while, her voice thoughtful, "it is not empty." And Elias looked out over the field, following her gaze, and he saw it then the way she did, not just dirt and grass and distance, but something held together by time, by care, by the quiet decisions made day after day. "It never was," he said, and there was something in his tone that carried more meaning than the words themselves. Lena nodded slightly, her fingers brushing the pendant where it rested now against her chest, no longer hidden, no longer needing to be, and she looked down at it for a brief moment before lifting her eyes again. "It feels lighter," she said, and Elias glanced at it, noticing how it no longer seemed to draw attention, no longer seemed to hold that quiet pull it had before. "Maybe it is," he replied. "Or maybe you are." And Lena considered that, her expression thoughtful, and then she gave a small nod, as if accepting something she had not yet fully understood. The wind moved gently across the field, carrying the scent of sun-warmed grass and distant hills, and the cattle shifted slowly in the distance, their movements steady, predictable, grounding the moment in something real and simple. They reached the edge of the property where the fence turned and followed the curve of the land, and Lena stopped there, her gaze drifting out beyond the boundary, toward the horizon that stretched far, beyond anything they could see clearly. And for a moment, she stood still, as if measuring the distance, not with her eyes, but with something deeper. "I thought I would have to keep going," she said quietly, and Elias stood beside her, his posture relaxed, his eyes following the same line out into the distance. "Most people do," he replied. "They think the answer is always somewhere else." And Lena turned her head slightly, looking at him, and there was a faint shift in her expression. Something softer, something more certain. "But it was here," she said, and Elias nodded once, because now he understood that too, not as an idea, but as something he had lived without naming. The sun climbed higher, the light growing warmer, casting long shadows that slowly shortened as the day moved on, and Elias pushed the fence post gently to test its strength, the wood holding firm, and he gave a small, satisfied nod before stepping back. Lena watched him for a moment, then stepped forward, and placed her hand lightly against the same post, feeling its surface, its steadiness, and there was something in that small gesture that mirrored what had happened the night before, something being tested, something being understood without words. "It holds," she said, and Elias looked at her, then at the post, then back at her, and he let out a quiet breath that carried something close to a smile. "It does," he replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than either of them needed. To explain, they turned back toward the house together, their steps unhurried, the rhythm of their movement settling into something shared, and the land stretched out around them, unchanged in shape, unchanged in form, but no longer the same, because now it held more than just silence. It held presence, it held choice, it held something that had been placed there not by accident, but by a series of quiet decisions that had led them both to this point. Lena glanced once more toward the horizon before turning fully back, and there was no hesitation left in her movement, no pull to keep going, no need to run, just a quiet acceptance of where she stood, and Elias walked beside her without speaking, because some things did not need to be said once they were understood, and the wind moved gently across the field, carrying nothing away, only settling. what had already found its place. The afternoon stretched long and golden across the land, the kind of light that softened everything it touched, and Elias found himself slowing without meaning to, his steps less about getting somewhere and more about staying present in the moment that was already there. And Lena walked beside him now without distance, no longer trailing behind, no longer observing from the edge, but moving in quiet rhythm with him as if she had always belonged within the space they shared. The house came into view ahead, its shape familiar and unchanged, yet carrying something different now. Something settled into its walls that had not been there before, and Elias paused just short of the porch, his gaze lingering on the doorway, remembering not in words but in feeling the moment she had stood there for the first time, small against the frame, carrying something far heavier than it appeared. Lena followed his gaze, and for a brief second, her expression shifted, not with doubt, not with hesitation, but with recognition, as if she too could feel the echo of that moment still resting in the air. "This is where it ended," she said quietly, and Elias shook his head once, a small motion, steady. "No," he replied, his voice calm. "This is where it changed," and the difference between those two things settled gently between them, not as a correction, but as an understanding. Lena stepped forward onto the porch, her hand brushing lightly against the doorframe, her fingers tracing the worn wood as if feeling for something beneath its surface, and Elias watched her without interrupting, because he knew that whatever she was sensing, it was not something that could be explained, only experienced. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, and when she stepped inside, it was not like entering a place she had found, but like returning to somewhere she had already been in a way she did not yet fully understand. Elias followed, closing the door behind him, and the room held that same quiet warmth. The fire rekindled just enough to fill the space with soft light, and Lena moved toward it, kneeling slightly, her hand extending toward the heat without touching it. And for a moment, she simply stayed there, still, listening in a way that had nothing to do with sound. "She knew," Lena said again, softer this time, almost as if she was speaking to the room itself, and Elias leaned lightly against the wall, arms resting at his sides, letting her words settle where they needed to. "She knew this place would hold what needed to be held," Lena continued, her gaze lifting slightly, and Elias understood then that it was not just about the pendant, not just about whatever it had carried, but about something less visible, something that could not be taken or handed over, something that required a place, a person, a moment. Lena slowly opened her hand, revealing the pendant once more, but it looked different now. Not because it had changed, but because whatever it had contained was no longer there, its surface plain, its weight simple, and she studied it for a long second before setting it gently on the table beside her, not discarding it, not keeping it close, just placing it where it belonged now, as something that had completed its purpose. Elias watched the movement, the quiet finality of it, and he felt something settle in him again, a sense of closure that did not come from endings, but from things finding their place. "What was it?" he asked after a moment, not because he needed an answer, but because the question itself felt like part of the process. And Lena looked at the pendant, then at him, her expression calm, grounded. "It was never something you could see," she said. "It was something you had to become," and the words did not explain anything, and yet they explained everything. And Elias nodded slowly, because he understood that not all truths came in forms that could be held or measured. The fire crackled softly, a small sound that filled the space between them without breaking it, and Lena stood up, brushing her hands lightly against her clothes. Her posture relaxed now in a way it had not been before, and she looked around the room, taking it in not as a place she might leave, but as a place she had chosen. "She trusted you," Lena said, her voice steady, and Elias looked at her, then at the door, then back at her, and he let out a slow breath, not heavy, not burdened, just real. "She trusted you," he replied, and Lena gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that did not need to be seen to be understood. Outside, the wind moved gently across the land, carrying no urgency, no echo of what had come before, just the quiet rhythm of something continuing as it always had. And inside, the room held that same steady warmth, the fire low, the light soft, and the pendant resting quietly on the table. No longer a key, no longer a map. Just a reminder of something that had passed through and left its mark without leaving anything behind. Lena moved toward the door once more, opening it slightly, letting the late afternoon light spill in, and she stood there for a moment, looking out, not with longing, not with uncertainty, but with peace. And Elias watched her from where he stood, understanding that whatever had brought her here had already done its work, and what remained now was not a question of where to go, but of how to stay, and in that quiet space, with the land stretching wide beyond the door and the fire steady behind them. Both of them stood without speaking, because some endings did not need words to be complete. Evening returned the way it always did, slow and unannounced, the light fading from gold to amber, and then into the quiet blue that settled over the land like a familiar blanket. And Elias stood on the porch once more, not because he had something to wait for, but because it had become a place where things made sense without needing to be spoken. Behind him, the door remained slightly open, the warmth of the fire drifting outward in thin currents that mixed with the cooling air, and inside, Lena moved quietly, her steps no longer cautious, no longer measured for escape, but natural, as if the space had already learned her presence and welcomed it without question. Elias rested his hands lightly against the railing, his gaze stretching out across the wide land that had once felt endless in a way that pressed against him, and now felt endless in a way that gave him room to breathe. And the wind moved gently, carrying nothing urgent, nothing demanding, just the quiet rhythm of a place that did not need to change to become something more. He heard her before he saw her, the soft sound of her steps behind him, and when Lena stepped out onto the porch, she did not stop at the doorway this time. She came to stand beside him, close enough that their presence shared the same space without hesitation, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer something to fill, but something to rest in. "It is quieter now," Lena said softly, her eyes following the line of the horizon where the last light still lingered, and Elias nodded once. "It always is, after something finds where it belongs," he replied, and the words settled easily, not heavy, not forced, just true in a way that did not need to be proven. Lena looked out across the land, her expression calm, steady, and there was no trace of the urgency that had once driven her steps, no shadow of the running that had brought her here, only presence, only stillness. And after a moment, she reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the pendant before she pulled it out, holding it loosely in her hand, and she looked at it not as something that carried meaning, but as something that had once done its part and now simply remained. "What happens to it now?" she asked, not because she needed direction, but because the question itself felt like part of the ending, and Elias glanced at it briefly, then back out over the land. "It stays," he said simply, "same as everything else that has done what it needed to do." And Lena considered that, her fingers turning the pendant once, twice, before she nodded slowly, understanding not with logic, but with something deeper. She stepped forward slightly, placing the pendant gently on the railing beside them, not setting it aside, not hiding it away, just leaving it there where the light could still touch it, where it could exist without purpose. And she withdrew her hand, letting it rest at her side, her shoulders relaxing in a way that spoke of something finally released. The sky darkened further, the first stars beginning to appear, faint at first, then clearer as the last of the light slipped away, and Elias watched them the way he always had. But this time there was something different in it, something shared, because he was no longer the only one standing there, no longer the only one seeing it. Lena followed his gaze upward, her eyes tracing the same points of light, and for a moment, the two of them stood there without speaking, without needing to, because the moment itself held everything that needed to be said. "She will not come," Lena said quietly after a while, her voice carrying no sadness, no longing, just understanding, and Elias did not look at her when he answered, his gaze still on the sky. "No," he said. "She already did what she needed to do." And Lena nodded, because she understood that now, not as an absence, but as a completion. The wind moved again, softer than before, brushing past them, lifting the edge of the pendant slightly before letting it settle back against the wood, and the sound of it was quiet, almost unnoticeable, But it marked the moment in a way that felt final, not as an ending, but as something fully realized. Elias shifted his weight slightly, his boots pressing firmly against the porch, grounding him in the place that had been his for so long. And he glanced once at Lena, not studying her, not questioning, just acknowledging her presence beside him. And she met his gaze with that same steady calm, no longer searching, no longer measuring, just there. "You are not alone anymore," Lena said softly, and Elias let out a slow breath, the kind that carries something unspoken with it. And he gave a small nod, not because he needed to agree, but because he felt it, clear and undeniable, in a way that went beyond words. The fire inside the house crackled softly, a warm, steady sound that reached them even out here, and the land stretched out before them, wide and quiet, holding everything that had happened without needing to change its shape, and the pendant rested on the railing between them, still, ordinary, no longer a key, no longer a map, just a small piece of something that had passed through and found its place. And as the night settled fully, wrapping the land in its quiet embrace, Elias Turner stood there beside Lena, saying nothing, needing nothing more, because out here, justice had not come with force or noise, it had come quietly, in the simple act of not turning away, and in that silence, everything that mattered had already been said.